Andy McCarthy, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time. You had a really great piece about this where you kind of broke down exactly Alvin Bragg's strategy. He is, ultimately, he's trying to charge Trump with a misdemeanor, and you said that this can be inflated into a felony. Explain this for people because, there's the discussion that, well, I mean, it's, a question of morals if you're going to have a mistress, and it's not technically illegal to pay your mistress off. But there's a caveat here that you wrote about that has to do with the first year of Trump's presidency. Enlighten us on this.
Well, thanks so much, Dana. The funny thing about this thing is the salacious details that I think people are most interested in, obviously, are almost irrelevant in the sense that, like, Stormy Daniels says she had, fling with Trump. Trump says it didn't happen. Whether it did or it didn't is unimportant to the case, because what the case is about is the booking, not the non-disclosure agreement itself. There was a non-disclosure agreement that was entered into in October of 2016. The case is about how that was booked on the Trump organization records. So what people need to understand, as you just mentioned, the morals aspect of it, really irrelevant to the legal reality. The non-disclosure agreement itself, there's nothing illegal about non-disclosure agreements. They are a staple of the justice system. They're a common way that civil litigation ends. So what we're talking about is Michael Cohen, on Trump's behalf, pays $130,000 to Stormy Daniels on the eve of the 2016 election to buy her silence, which is what happens in a non-disclosure agreement. And then they have to decide how Trump is going to pay him back. So rather than paying him back in a lump sum, they did some bookkeeping razzmatazz and paid him through 2017 in monthly installments, because it was combined with other things that they owed him money for. And because, as they put it, they grossed it up so that he wouldn't take a tax hit. Because let's remember, the reimbursement of a debt is not taxable, right? If I lend you money and you pay me back, that's not a taxable event. But if you do legal services for me, it is a taxable event. It's taxable income. So they grossed up the 130,000. Basically, they doubled it so that he wouldn't take a tax bite. And then they combined it with other things and paid him in $35,000 installments through 2017. The last payment was December 5th of 2017. So what the charge is, we think, is falsification of business records. In New York, that is a misdemeanor. And what simply happened here, I think the most succinct way to describe it is there was the reimbursement for a debt that accrued in 2016. And instead, in their records, they booked it as the payment of legal fees in 2017. So that's the falsification part. In New York, no one would get prosecuted for this. In fact, the district attorney we have in New York is a guy who's best known for taking actual felony conduct and degrading it to misdemeanors if he prosecutes it at all.
Right.
Here he's taking nonsense that's pretty stale. I mean, we're talking about 17-year-old, liaison and a 7-year-old non-disclosure agreement and a 6-year-old stream of payments. Presumably what happened is that stream of payments generates other financial records, because remember, you would not settle up for the tax obligations of 2017 until 2018, right? So presumably that would put you into 2018. I'm being nerdy about the dates because the statute of limitations is a big issue in this case.
And so
if it's a misdemeanor,
if
it's a misdemeanor in New York, the statute of limitations is only 2 years. So if it started to run in 2018, it would have lapsed in 2020. A felony is 5 years. So in order to turn this trifling, stale transaction that is a misdemeanor in New York law into a felony, Bragg would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump intended, by falsifying the records, to conceal another crime he had committed. which is why you're hearing all this stuff about campaign finance law and, other abstruse potential felonies. I think it's the looniest thing you can imagine, because campaign finance laws, to the extent they're relevant to a presidential election, are federal. They're not state.
Right.
When New York law says to conceal another crime, since that's the New York Penal Code, we have to assume they're talking about another New York crime. I don't think a federal charge does it. I wouldn't think, for example, like a crime against Sharia would do it. I don't think a crime against the law of France would do it. When they say another crime, they're talking about New York crimes. So a federal crime is not going to do it for them. And I don't even think, if it did, that this is a campaign finance violation. That's the reason my old office, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District, which had this investigation initially, they walked away from it because they didn't see a crime here. So the idea that the Manhattan District Attorney is going to vindicate federal campaign finance laws that the feds themselves didn't think were violated here seems kind of nuts to me. And the other thing is, even if you thought there was another crime here, it's not enough to show that there's some other crime that trained lawyers are having trouble identifying that's lurking around this. You would also have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump knew of that crime and intended to cover it up by the bookkeeping. I'm not sure they're going to be able to prove that he even knew how his subordinates were keeping the books. But the best interpretation of the facts, I think, as we understand them, is he was probably trying to conceal the non-disclosure arrangement with a porn star from his wife or from voters in the 2016 election. I think probably the last thing on earth that he had in his mind was to conceal another felony that none of us can figure out, what the hell felony it is.
That's the best. That is the best way to put it. Talking with our friend Andy McCarthy. You can find him on Twitter, Andrew CMC Carthy, Andrew C. McCarthy. Because you answered, two of my questions right there. I mean, how this calls into play campaign finance law, because it's going into 2017 and 2018, and then the tactic of trying to inflate this into a felony. That seems like a really, really tall order. Do you think that Bragg is kind of bluffing here? Because it all seems like such cloak and dagger. We heard that I guess the grand jury was looking at this week. Trump was saying that he was going to be arrested today. I don't know where he got that, but that's what he was saying. Now, apparently, it looks like if he's arraigned, it might be next week. Is that typical for a misdemeanor? Do you honestly think that that's typical for a misdemeanor, that all that theater? And then secondly, that seems like such a tall order, as you wrote, to inflate this into a felony. He's got to be bluffing. Bragg has to be bluffing.
Well, on the misdemeanor versus felony thing, you don't need the grand jury to indict a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
Under the Constitution, you get grand jury protection to the extent it is protection, right, to have a body that would indict a ham sandwich, as they say. But that is the grand inquest of the people is your protection from overzealous prosecutors, in theory. But you only get that for felonies. So if it was a misdemeanor that he was looking for, he could do that on his own. He wouldn't need the grand jury for that. Now, so you have to presume if he's doing this, it's a felony. And it looks like he's doing all the things a prosecutor would do to bring the case. So, for example, in New York law, Dana, when I was a federal prosecutor, the grand jury rules are very loosey-goosey. I could put an FBI agent on who's like the case agent in the case and give the grand jury by hearsay what the testimony of all the other witnesses would have been. Whereas in New York law, they actually require you to bring the witnesses in. You can't do it by hearsay. So that's why people may have been wondering, why on earth do they need Michael Cohen to come in and testify again when he's testified like 8 zillion times about this in front of Congress and in federal court, et cetera? They need to put the actual witnesses in the case in the grand jury. So they did that for 2 days last week with Cohen. The other thing that New York law does is the target of a grand jury investigation gets invited, not subpoenaed, because it's not compulsory, invited to come in at the very end and try to talk the grand jury out of charging him. He can answer questions, and if he's got a reasonable explanation of what he did, then the grand jury may not indict. Almost no target ever takes the prosecutor up on this because they figure by the time you're at the end of your grand jury investigation, they've decided to indict anyway. So why help them by giving them testimony, right?
Right.
But in terms of the procedure, they did that with Trump last week. They invited him to come in, and his lawyers declined. So you wouldn't think they would be doing that unless they were pretty serious about the case.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So I think what happened with the I'm going to be arrested on Tuesday. First of all, I don't think Trump's going to be arrested at all in the traditional sense. What's going to happen is Bragg has a grand jury that apparently meets on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So one of those days, maybe Wednesday this week, maybe Thursday this week, they'll file an indictment. It could happen next week for all we know. We're not in control of that, and we may not know it if they file it under seal even when it happens. But what will happen is the grand jury will indict on one of the days that it sits, and then they will work out between the DA's office, the NYPD, and the Secret Service when Trump will come from Mar-a-Lago to surrender. The DA's office in Lower Manhattan is in a criminal courthouse. So what would happen is they'll bring Trump in, the NYPD would process him. They won't put handcuffs on him. This is a nonviolent case, and he's in Secret Service protection.
That's what I would wondered.
Yeah, so I think what will happen is people should know that for all the brickbats that are going back and forth between the Trump camp and the Bragg camp, Secret Service and the NYPD are very good police organizations, and they cooperate with each other all the time. There's a lot of Secret Service protectees who spend a lot of time in New York. So this situation is unprecedented, but it's not unusual for them to cooperate. And they'll make sure the two things that have to happen, which is Trump will remain secure. He'll be in Secret Service protection as always. And the New York City police will make sure he gets processed like everybody else who comes in the system, and that he gets produced in court for what I think will be a quick court proceeding. This is a nonviolent case, so he'll get released on his own recognizance. He'll be being brought in on a formal indictment, so they'll probably have an arraignment where he'll enter a plea formally. It'll be a plea of not guilty. And then the case will be assigned to a judge, and they'll schedule pretrial motions, and we'll be off to the races.
Wow, this is going to be something to watch. There's no lead up. It's just going to happen all at once. And boy, oh boy, the storm around that. Andy McCarthy, his book, Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Fabulous read. I actually just loaned it to my stepdad. It's a great book. Andy always, I got him a copy too, but he wanted to read it when he was here, and he started in on it, so I had to let him take it with him. But it's so good to talk to you.
You made my day. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you.
Take care.